Well, hello, my name is Zac Neubauer. I am the president of EFAC-USA. It's the U.S. branch of the Evangelical Fellowship in the Anglican Communion, a group started by John Stott in the 1960s. My guest here this afternoon was a member of EFAC-USA, and it's a prior iteration as Fellowship of Witness back in the early 80s, and we might mention that a little bit. But today I want to introduce you to Gillis Harp. He is a history professor at Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, and as well as teaching history, specializing in American history. He's also thinks about all things Anglican and publishes them from time to time. I want to chat with him about his most recent article in Modern Reformation about looking back at the book Evangelicals on the Canterbury Trail and Robert Webber's book from the 1980s, and looking at how that has influenced North American evangelical Anglicanism and North American Anglicanism as a whole, and just think about that. So Gillis, I've done it already. Gillis,
okay.
Great to have you, and
Thanks,
looking
Zach.
forward to chatting with you.
Thanks for the invitation.
So you were part of what is now EFAC-USA in the early 80s, is that correct?
Yeah, going way back. I remember a couple of organizational meetings in like 1982, one at University of Virginia, which is where I was doing my graduate work, and with a few people and a handful of folks. And then a couple later, I remember a meeting that we helped organize, back in the late 80s. Yeah, good times.
Yeah, well, thank you for being part of our legacy. So this article that you've recently wrote for Modern Reformation, tell us a little bit about it. How did it come about, and what's the basis of the article? We'll post a link to it when we post this interview, so you can read it in full. But
thank you. Yeah.
Summary.
Yeah, speaking of the 1980s, it kind of takes me back to the 80s. So the publication of the book by Robert Webber. I remember at the time reading it, thinking about it, and reading not too many critical assessments of it, mostly pretty glowing, positive assessments of it. And I think there were some good things in the book too. But I wanted to do kind of a critical, almost 40th anniversary evaluation of it, especially since some of the things that he talks about, this pilgrimage of non-Anglican evangelicals to the liturgical church, some to the Episcopal Church, some now, of course, in the wake of the formation of the ACNA to the ACNA, and some to other traditions, Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. That little trickle became kind of a stream, a steady stream, and I thought it was important to revisit some of the questions that he asked, to look at some of the reasoning. It's a very impressionistic book. It's a very personal book. Nothing wrong with that. But there's definitely some theological issues that I thought it raised. Theological and historical issues I thought it raised, especially about Anglican identity. What were they being attracted to? They kept repeating that it was Anglicanism, and sometimes I wasn't so sure. So I wanted to kind of kick around some of those thoughts, and I thought that Modern Reformation might be a good place to do that.
So in the 80s, you were attending an Episcopal church at the time, and that was part of it, or what?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We were. I guess I was a grad student at the University of Virginia, and there wasn't a lot of choice. Things are better in Charlottesville now. Wasn't a lot of choice about going to a decent Episcopal church in those days. So we were attending. I would say we, because I was engaged to be married. We got married in 1983. So my wife and I were attending, soon-to-be wife, were attending a couple different churches in the area, and then I got involved in trying to kind of revive FOW, which was kind of I don't want to say comatose, but maybe sleeping slightly, and I helped to bring about a little bit of a temporary revival of FOW.
So I discovered what we might call evangelical Anglicanism, or confessional Anglicanism, or reformational Anglicanism, a lot of terms there, while living in England. And so I grew up in the States, but didn't have any interaction with anything Episcopal or Anglican at the time, and came to embrace that while living in England, and then came back to the States, still not having any connection, and ended up at Trinity School for Ministry. And I found Weber's book being referenced a lot, or if not referenced, just as kind of it was a mark in a lot of people's journey into Anglicanism. And I was really surprised that a book, at that time, a book that was 15 years old, 35 years old, or so, was so influential, or just was such a touchstone for a lot of different people. And so then it kind of helped me at least make some sense of the North American Anglican tradition that I was experiencing, being in some ways similar to the evangelical Anglicanism I'd experienced in England, but in a lot of ways very different from that.
Sure, you bet.
So could you maybe talk to that, especially you referenced kind of how it helped to form identity. How do you see that happening? What's different in the, we now have the ACNA, as you referenced, so it's not the same world as
right
1985, but what's different? How did Weber and his book kind of change how Episcopalians and now Anglicans thought of themselves?
Yeah, I think in the article I talk a little bit about some of the different reasons why they left their kind of home church tradition, how many of them came from, and this was difficult for me to relate to since I didn't come from an evangelical background. I came from a kind of nominally very liberal Protestant background, and they came from often fundamentalist backgrounds. Weber came from was a graduate of Bob Jones University. So they came from fundamentalist or independent evangelical backgrounds, and certainly many of the things that they were concerned about, I could appreciate and understand, even though I didn't come from those traditions. I could certainly be sympathetic about, the kind of strident fundamentalism, the kind of the emphasis on division. And division over often very minor things, majoring in minors, kind of being a definition of fundamentalism. I could appreciate that. I could appreciate the kind of ahistorical approach to worship and to the church in general. That the church basically, there was a kind of blank page between the 1950s and our Lord's crucifixion, and then nothing kind of really happened in between, or it was mostly darkness, and certainly as an historian, I thought, well, that's a legitimate beef, that's a legitimate concern, this sort of ahistorical approach. And then social taste and class, I think, also is part of the factors into this. People coming from kind of a blue collar background or a lower middle class background, and objecting to some of the kind of tacky populism of fundamentalism, and being introduced to a higher level of taste in terms of art, architecture, music certainly is a big factor there. And then generally what Mark Knoll talks about, the scandal of the evangelical mind, that certainly was an understandable driving force for them, that they were concerned about the church's attitude towards science, toward the hard sciences, the church's attitude toward the life of the mind in general. And so they found something attractive in the Anglican tradition. My concern was, of course, that what they were discovering was generally a kind of Anglo-Catholicism rather than a low church evangelical Anglicanism. It struck me, I remember almost immediately when I first read Weber's book, well, he's not talking about the people that I know in the Anglican communion worldwide, prominent individuals like John Stott or J.I. Packer. They weren't even mentioned. And instead, he mentions a number of now quite obscure Anglo-Catholics in the Episcopal Church. And I thought that was interesting. That was revealing. also the lack of focus or emphasis or any attention at all paid on the Reformation, kind of dismissed in a kind of offhand way. I thought that was interesting. Not just no focus on the Reformation in general, but no focus on the English Reformation. Kind of a reference to Cranmer, but not really an interest to discovering Cranmer's theology or exploring his doctrine. And then the prayer book, I thought that was also revealing that they weren't really interested in Cranmer's 1552 or the classic 1662 prayer book. Instead, they seemed very interested in the American 1979 book, which bore little resemblance to what Cranmer was doing. In fact, it tried systematically to undo quite a bit of what Cranmer was up to. So I thought that was very interesting. And in some of the early reviews of the book, that was absent. Although I quote actually a review from an old friend that was published in the English Churchman. Of course, it was published in the Churchman, not in an American publication, that asked some hard questions about the book and about its Anglo-Catholicism and about kind of also, ironically, its emotionalism, how much it emphasized human emotion. Again, maybe reflecting that some of that Pentecostal background, some of that fundamentalist background of some of the authors. Of course, it wasn't just Robert Weber. It was a collection of folks who were telling their experiences.
Yeah. It's a very you mentioned, I forget the wording you used toward the more at the beginning of the interview, but it's an emotional book. I mean, it's a personal.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
So I think that impacts how we have to read it.
Yes, you bet.
So how what I joke, because I hadn't heard of Robert Weber until after I discovered Anglicanism and was going to seminary, but I discovered Evangelical Anglicanism while living in the Diocese of Canterbury in England, and so I joke that here I am. I was a graduate of Moody Bible Institute, kind of basically the kind of person that Weber is expecting and anticipating to be attracted to Anglicanism. But what I found was the Anglicanism that Weber described was not appealing to me whatsoever. And actually what did draw, I mean, I think he's asking the right questions, but maybe not coming up with the right answers, or at least not in my experience of how I discovered it. And so what I found appealing mostly was the prayer book. I remember discovering the collects for the first time and just saying, who wrote these? These are incredible. And these are so powerful and so timely. And so how in the idea of maybe asking the right questions, but not necessarily having the right answers. Where does that lead? Maybe I'm trying to put words into your mouth, but I've seen some folks on the Canterbury Trail who then the destination, the arrival point isn't Canterbury. It's Rome or
sure, right,
Orthodoxy or other points. So how do you think that? Can you comment on that and how you've seen that play out?
Yeah, and it's kind of an historical identity question. I think that's one of the problems with Weber's approach. And I don't mean to be too critical of Weber. I think there's some good things in there too, but that he's not really an historian, and so he doesn't really have a good grasp on the history of the Anglican Church or its traditions. He doesn't really look. I mean, he's looking at his portrait of the Anglican Church is a portrait of high church. It's from what's sometimes called the Beretta Belt, which is the northern part of the northern Midwest. So his exposure and the individual that he interacted with was a Bishop of Chicago, who was a liberal Anglo-Catholic. And by the way, the theological liberalism is also part of the picture here that's sometimes not addressed. That even though Weber doesn't embrace theological liberalism, he leans that way on some issues and some questions. And so he's attracted to the Episcopal Church in part because it's more theologically liberal. And that's still true for some on the Canterbury Trail, obviously, maybe not so much for those who end up in the ACNA. But I think it's really it boils down to partly an Anglican identity issue, right? That that if you don't have that historical perspective, then Anglicanism can become, I've said this in other articles, kind of a wax nose that you can kind of make it into your dream church or to your sort of peculiar selection, rather cherry picking out different things from different centuries. And I was struck by how Weber and his converts never really looked or engaged in the Anglican formularies, which are all Reformation formularies. So 39 articles, that was treated as kind of an embarrassment. Well, they're not to be taken too seriously if they're treated at all, or they're given a kind of bizarre reinterpretation that kind of rips them out of their historical context. It's a particularly bad commentary by E.J. Bicknell that does that. It's just, I mean, it doesn't have an historical leg to stand on. So they dismiss something like the 39 articles, and then they don't really engage with the 1662 prayer book or that tradition. As I said earlier, they're curiously fond of the 79 book that has this outrageously Pelagian statement of faith in it, catechism, and the other parts of the tradition are absent also, so that they're not familiar with the homilies, another one of the Reformation formularies, and they don't really know what the Anglican Church looked like or what worship in the church looked like for over 300 years, because it's all read through this Anglo-Catholic lens, and even the founders of the Tractarian movement were not really into a lot of that ceremonialism. It's really the second generation that becomes the sort of Anglo-Catholic movement at the turn of the century. This is circa 1900 or so, 1890s. But all of that is ignored, and instead you get folks who don't know a lot of the history, unfortunately, and therefore are kind of free to make up their own version of Anglicanism. And it's in some ways a very American thing, this ahistorical approach and kind of make your own religion. Is it Robert Bella who talks about interviewing a woman who talks about her religion, and he refers to it, her name was Sheila, and he calls it Sheilaism, where she kind of just pulls together a collection of different things. And there's no grounding, it's not rooted at all in history. It's just sort of personal preference.
Yeah, and so I think that's I think maybe that's the big gist that I see in the book, is that ahistorical approach is, I think, this kind of the main weakness. And like I said, wanting to be fair to the book. I mean, it's not. I don't think Weber would argue that it's a scholarly book.
Right. No. Sure.
And it is kind of a personal experience. But how do you think that? Why was kind of the ideas behind the book able to take root in the Episcopal Church and especially in what's now become the ACNA? I think there must have been some fertile ground kind of there that allowed that to take root, and in a way that wouldn't in Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, for example.
I think in part because there wasn't this of course didn't happen. Think about it. It didn't happen in England. It didn't happen in Australia. It happened to a lesser degree in Canada. And why was that? Well, in part, I would argue that in part it has to do with a survival of the Evangelical Party within the Church of England, within the Australian Church, to some extent within the Canadian Church, though that's rapidly disappearing now, sad to say. That there really was a tradition, a living tradition, that people could go and say, well, this is what I can walk down the street and go to a parish that looks different. It's not an Anglo-Catholic parish. It's the worship is different. There's a real emphasis on expository preaching and so on. So we had no frame of reference to that in the United States, because the Evangelical Party in the Episcopal Church had essentially disappeared, had almost evaporated certainly by 1900 or so. It's not there. And so you really have to do a kind of historical recovery act to say, no, wait a minute. We're not just talking about the Church of England, but there was a vibrant, vital, significant, indeed large evangelical movement within the Protestant Episcopal Church. Remember the real name, Protestant Episcopal Church, from colonial times to the late 19th century, and had a powerful shaping influence. Now, how that all fell apart is a fascinating story, and one that I've addressed a little bit in an article I did for Anglican Episcopal History a few years back. And we can refer to that or talk about that maybe at some other time. But I think part of it is just that folks were interested in a kind of romantic journey, and there was this lack of any kind of human interaction with a living evangelical tradition, and so that kind of opened the door to some of this romanticization of a Anglican past that never really existed. It's kind of a fantasy. I mean, the Anglo-Catholic tradition certainly existed. I'm just saying that to portray that as somehow the sort of
totality,
the entire picture, right? Exactly.
Yeah, and that is a conversation that we're hoping to have another time. The article
Sure.
he's referencing is called the strange death of evangelical Episcopalianism. That's correct?
That's right. Yes, and I think it's a really fascinating story, and I'm not sure I've fully explained it. I think I've suggested a few things. I've drawn from some of the work of Diana Butler and Alan Gelzo, who's written on the subject, but I'm not sure we've fully explained it. But I hope the piece at least makes some interesting suggestions.
Yeah. So we'll put a link to that. I think it's paywalled, but you might be able.
Oh yes, sure. Right.
Folks might be able to get a chance at it if going through a library system or something like that. But yeah, I'd love to have that conversation a bit more another time. So in thinking about all that, then you finish up your article with two questions. You say, is it possible to promote a more thoughtful historical consciousness without returning to 19th century romanticism? And you say, can one revive proper sacramental observance without indulging in ritualism or medieval mysticism and asceticism? Two great questions there, but you leave them unanswered, and so it's a fill in the blank. But so without asking you to do all the hard work of identifying the issues and giving us a solution, do you have some thoughts on the two questions you raised at the end?
Well, this is going to sound really self-serving coming from an historian. The first surprise, the first thing I'm going to say is you need to read history. Need to get our lay people to really re-engage with the historical tradition. Again, not to say that it's infallible. It's not. Not to say that the historical tradition can't evolve and develop over time. Of course. But at least engage with the historical reality of what Anglicanism actually looked like circa 1840, or if you want to say before the Tractarian movement in the 1830s. What did it look like? And definitely reading. So read the history. There's some good resources here, including not just Church of England's history, but also the Protestant Episcopal Church. It's a wonderful old book. I don't know if someone's reprinted it. If they haven't, they should. By Chorley. The chap's name is Chorley. Men and Movements in the Episcopal Church. Yeah. No, it
hasn't been reprinted, but that's on the to-do list eventually.
Oh, really? It's wonderful. And he's actually, even though he's not that sympathetic to evangelicalism, he's actually quite fair in showing and giving a good overview and some detailed analysis of individual evangelical ministries going back to the 18th and 19th centuries. And he paints really a fascinating portrait of conflict and party strife. And well, obviously, the conflict and party strife part is not the one part we want to return to. But he does a really brilliant job. So, just kind of reintroduce yourself to the history. And then also, I'd say really, re-engage and kind of try to recover. It's a work of recover an understanding of the formularies, of the Reformation formularies. And fortunately now there's some newer new commentaries on the articles out there. Bishop John Rogers has a nice, very accessible one. My friend Gerald Bray has one. Really nice commentaries on the 39 articles that are helpful. Let's recover that tradition. Let's try to understand 1662 prayer book and its features. There are those folks who are maybe put off by the kind of Elizabethan language. There are modern language versions of that that are actually pretty good, I think, and worth using.
The first book of homilies in modern English.
That's right. Oh, yes, I've forgotten about that. Yes, good point. Yeah. So there's lots out there, and many of these things I think would make a really good adult ed class, a Sunday morning, to get lay people plugged into that, and I think could be really an enriching experience for a lot of folks.
Yeah, and so we thought maybe that was the last question, but following up that last part you just said, that
Sure.
enriching experience, what is it? I think part of what Weber did so well was to present this as his kind of vision of Anglicanism as something that you wanted to be part of, or was appealing.
Yes.
Why is a more reformational or evangelical approach to Anglicanism appealing to folks?
I think because it balances it balances things like word and sacrament. It doesn't indulge in a kind of quasi medieval sacramentalism. It focuses on the primacy of the word. I remember Philip Hughes, distinguished New Testament scholar and a great Anglican theologian in his own right. By the way, that's a wonderful book to read. Philip Hughes' Theology of the English Reformers, highly recommended, very accessible, thorough, really interesting. Philip Hughes used to emphasize, remember that the word, remember the importance of the primacy of the ministry of the word, that the sacraments come out of the ministry of the word, that they're not on equal footing, that the sacraments are the word visible, but first you have to have the word audible. So I think to strike that balance, right, to recover, to recognize that you don't have to stop being a Protestant to become liturgical, that you have this wonderful, rich liturgical tradition that I think is greatly underappreciated. So you don't have to set aside the wonderful insights on St. Paul's teaching about justification by grace alone, through faith alone. You don't have to set that aside in order to be liturgical. You've got a prayer book, you've got a Book of Common Prayer that expresses that doctrine almost on every page. And so that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, and you're in a wonderful place there. I'll commend my friend Ethan Magnus. You attend his parish, Grace Anglican, there in Grove City, and they do a wonderful job of doing exactly what you said.
We're very blessed, and we realize as we move around, not everyone has access to such a wonderful parish, and we helped out with the beginnings of it. We felt from the beginning, I'm sure Ethan would say this too, that if that there wasn't an opportunity for folks to go to a Protestant church that really emphasized good expository preaching and liturgical worship, that was a wonderful combination that was relatively rare, surprisingly rare. And I think by the grace of God, the growth that we've seen is in part because it is a relatively rare thing. People are attracted to it.
Yeah, make sure we'll put a link down on the notes with that too. So thank you, Gillis. The article we've been talking about, it's called Evangelicals on the Canterbury Trail, Reflections on the Pilgrimage to Anglicanism Nearly 40 Years After Weber's Classic. That's at modernreformation.org. We'll put a link there again, like I said. But thank you for your article. It was something I've been thinking about for a while and was trying to verbalize, and then right as I was running into people saying, well, maybe you should write something, and feeling woefully unequipped to write something.
Oh, I'm sure you could. You should. I encourage you to do so too.
Well, I don't have the historical experience that you have, so that's
well. Thank you for the invitation.
Helps me a lot to understand the situation we're in North American Anglicanism, and I think your suggestions point us to a better path forward. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Zac. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, and we will do it again sometime.
Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you.